One of my favorite cartoons growing up was the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. Anybody remember Rocky and Bullwinkle? Which featured a moose and a squirrel foiling evil Russian spies Boris and Natasha Badenoff. Nothing like a little Cold War comedic paranoia to go with your Captain Crunch early on Saturday morning. Now, Rocky and Bullwinkle were okay, but I really liked some of the other segments they had in the Rocky and Bullwinkle show, like Dudley Do-Right, the Canadian Mountie. But my favorite was Fractured Fairy Tales. And these were sort of different takes on old fairy tales. For example, instead of Sleeping Beauty, they had a fairy tale named Leaping Beauty. And instead of her falling asleep, she was cursed by the witch that everyone she talked to got so bored they fell asleep. Or Snow White, featuring the 7 dwarves as all con men. It was pretty funny stuff. Well, this morning, as we continue in our Fables for Families series, I've got another fairy tale to offer you, a fractured fairy tale, if you will, one that tells the other side of one of our famous fairy tales. You all know the story of Cinderella, right? The story of a young girl enslaved to do the dirty work of a wicked stepmother and her conniving daughters, and who was rescued by a wish-granting godmother and a handsome prince through the medium of pumpkins and sensible shoes. But you've probably never heard the other side of the story. You've probably not heard from Cinderella's stepmother herself. Well, today, all that changes. Deep in the recesses of the fairy tale part of the internet, we discovered a video of Cinderella's stepmother offering her rebuttal. And we're going to air it here in public for the first time. So let's listen in as she gives us her side of this fractured fairy tale.
On behalf of all the stepmothers of every age, everywhere, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's hard to believe that it has taken this long. But I'm glad that I finally get to tell my side of the story. In truth, it's likely that many of you did not know there was another side. It's tempting to use this opportunity to get even, to rebut and refute the stereotype that was assigned to me for many generations, the myth of my meanness. Equal time is a wonderful remedy, but it's difficult to tell my story without seeming defensive. So I've decided to simply tell it like it was, or at least how it was according to my perspective. You will have to determine the truth, but at least you will be able to discern it from another point of view. I first met Cinderella's father at a dance given by the king. It was to celebrate the completion of a new wing of the castle, and Cindy's father had been one of the contractors. Oh, I should mention, by the way, that we never ever called her Cinderella. She wouldn't hear of it. It wasn't folksy enough. I had been invited because my dead husband had been one of the original architects. I had just gone through a year of mourning, and the party was kind of a coming out for me. Cindy's father introduced himself, and I was immediately struck by his gentleness. He had a sad look about him that sparked compassion in my heart. He seemed quiet, intelligent, and he talked a lot about his daughter, who he obviously adored. He had lost his own wife several years earlier, and he choked up just mentioning her. He never did say what ailment had done her in. He lived alone with Cindy, a teenager, and except for an older, wealthy, widowed sister, about whom I shall have more to say later, he had few personal relationships. It was a pleasant enough evening, and I was glad to be out and about again. Oh, I was quite surprised, however, at what came next. The next evening, he came around with a basket of fruit and some flowers. My own daughters giggled, and they went out to play to leave us alone. I was overwhelmed. I had never received that much attention from my first husband in all our years together. Well, we went for a walk and we talked, and before I knew it, he proposed. I told him I had to think about it and spent most of the next day with my mind reeling. I'm generally not the impulsive type, but I was lonely, he made a good living, and would provide security for my own girls. And there was this yearning for me to care for someone. Most of all, I was flattered. Little did I know that soon all of that attention would cease. And little did I know what I would be in for with Cindy. Well, as soon as we moved in, I went about setting things to rights. While I would not consider myself orderly to a fault, I do believe that order is essential to a fruitful life. Though when it comes to kitchens, there I admit erring on the side of meticulous. My daughters, who were raised in this atmosphere, were naturally tidy. And perhaps it was a mistake on my part to assume that Cindy would have the same attitude. The truth is, however, that she had none of the same attitudes. She balked immediately at the mention of her assistance in just setting the table, fetching water, or cleaning the floor. I don't believe she ever held a broom. At first, I tried to persuade her that this was important for her own upbringing, as well as for the family. But she would throw a temper tantrum or run to her father, who always took her side by failing to support me. She spent a lot of time in her room, where she seemed to have an infinite capacity for staring out the window. I'll admit I wasn't sure of my own authority with her. After all, she wasn't really my daughter. Sometimes when my own daughters taunted her for not helping, she would come back with remarks obviously born out of her fantasy world. "You just wait and see," she would say. "Someday I won't have to live here any longer. Someday my prince will come." Well, things got worse. My daughters became more resentful, my husband spent more time away from the house, and my health began to suffer. Finally, I had to threaten my husband that we would leave if he didn't support me in this. He agreed, but he was never around to back me up. At least she could no longer run to him for help. She did, however, start running to my husband's sister. This sister, remember, was wealthy, childless, and gave Cindy absolutely everything she wanted. She never accepted me or my daughters either. All Cindy had to do was wish for something, and there was her aunt making it happen. And then, to top it all off, there's this flaky boy started hanging around. He had seen Cindy walking in her usual daydreamy way one day and must have sensed a kindred spirit. He had no trade, no goals, no idea what he would be doing with his life the next hour, let alone the next day. Another dreamer. But oh, he was a charmer too, that one. It seemed like they were made for one another. On the surface, he was always saying the right thing. He made passes at my daughters, too, but they found him revolting. Well, one day, Cindy and her charming prince just took off, and they never came back. At first, I wondered how they'd survive, though I suspected that sister-in-law of mine was involved somehow. But then it turns out that this kid was really a prince, the king's only son. He hadn't been minding his studies. He's been sneaking out herbs out of his garden, if you know what I mean. And he had gotten into bad company. But Daddy always took care of things, and he took care of these two dreamers in a big way. Next thing you know, Cindy and her prince are getting married in a big royal wedding. Everyone in the kingdom thinks Cindy's great, the best thing that ever happened to the prince. She sent a servant back to the house to collect her things. You don't think we were invited to the wedding, do you? I was disappointed, of course, embarrassed for my daughters, but worse was to come. The story started going around about this romance that the prince had been gone a long time. Oh, and found Cindy living in a hovel as a slave to her wicked witch of a stepmother and conniving stepsisters. Maybe this was Cindy's way of getting back at me, but the upshot of it was that we could no longer show our faces in town for a long time. Eventually, we had to move to another town. Looking back, though, I'm not sure I would have done things differently. I still believe in the values of energy, persistence, and order. Maybe I took on too much responsibility. I should have let her flake out all the way. After all, she was my husband's daughter. I probably should have waited longer to remarry, at any rate. One thing I did learn, however, I should not have backed off every time Cindy went running to her father and aunt to tell them how mean I was. I should have gotten meaner. You know, I think I was the only one who ever took a stand with her. But given the absence of limits in her life, that's the only thing she remembered about me. And maybe, as one of my daughters says, that's why she and her prince persisted in that myth about my meanness. It was probably the only way they could really live with one another happily ever after. Thank you for letting me tell my side of the story.
Cinderella's stepmother. Well, I want to thank Kim Craven for being Cinderella's stepmother, and Pastor Jeff for doing all of this in the studio, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Aldersgate Studios now getting a reputation. Well, we've been talking about family systems in this series, and we started by talking about responsibility with the fable of the bridge, where we learned that you can't motivate the unmotivated, and the only person you can make responsible is yourself. More enthusiasm would be good around that. It's just to let me know that you're learning what we're talking about. In the fable called A Nervous Condition, we learned that the most sensitive people in any system, the ones who are the most needy, tend to control everything, and we talked about how we can move toward the roar and choose not to be controlled by the anxiety of another. Then we talked about emotional triangles, how when there's a conflict between two parties, we tend to want to bring in a third to rescue one or the other, which really then leads to more conflict. We learned that the way to health is to de-triangulate by paying attention to our own anxiety and dealing directly with conflict. And then last week we talked about perfectionism and caught in our own web, and how anxiety is often manifested in an attempt at perfect performance, which is the illusion of control. The truth is we're not perfect, and that it's not our perfect performance that God wants so much, but rather perfection in love, living in relationship with God and with each other. Well, this morning, we heard from Cinderella's stepmother, the flip side of this famous story. And one of the things that this fable got me thinking about when I first read it from Edwin Friedman is that when you start to look at things through a family systems lens, a lot of these old stories, well, you realize they're kind of perpetuating dysfunction. It's interesting to watch how anxiety permeates the issues in so many of these stories. Now, I know that many of you are Disney fans out there. You know, the mouse has brought us a lot of great stories. We all know the songs and the characters and the classic fairy tales that Disney has brought to life. But one of the things I've noticed is that many of these old fairy tales, when they're brought to the screen, though they're entertaining, they do so in a subtle and entertaining way, perpetuate some less than helpful ideas about family systems. For example, how many stories have come to the screen about some big-eyed, small-waisted princess wanting a prince to come and rescue her from her anxiety-filled home? The plots are all just about the same. A child, or a fish, or a lion, or a mermaid gets upset with a parent who is trying to establish some boundaries. The basic premise of these fairy tales is that parents are always too controlling, or as Will Smith once said, parents just don't understand. The child or the corresponding animal runs away from said parents and gets into trouble. Child gets rescued by a third party, be it a handsome prince, fairy godmother, or hilarious sidekick, gets married, and supposedly lives happily ever after. Now, I don't want to bust on Disney here. There's a real danger that you'll want to string me up after this, talking bad about Disney. They're just retelling these old stories. But think about it for a minute. What lessons are we teaching through some of these stories? Kids, the way you manage your anxiety is by refusing to honor any boundaries, to run away and blame your parents, and then believe that the key to happiness is to be rescued by an equally needy partner. It's the emotional triangle writ large. Watch one of these movies closely next time, particularly the old ones. The new ones are not quite as obvious as this, but if you watch them with your family systems viewer on, and you'll see what I mean. I remember we were watching, when our kids were little, we were watching Bambi on the VCR, which is a very old sentence. And we're watching Bambi on the VCR, and there comes a point in the movie Bambi where Faylene, who's Bambi's dear love interest, gets cornered by a pack of wolves. And she's screaming out for Bambi to come and rescue her. And my wife, Jennifer, she stops the VCR at this point. And she turns to our daughter, who's all of 5 or 6. And she says to Hannah, "Now, Hannah, I want you to know something. Faylene does not need Bambi to come and rescue her. She could kick these wolves in the teeth if she wanted to. Just remember, you don't need a prince." And then she turned the video back on. You go, girl, right? That's it. I would love it if Disney would for once do a movie about what happens after Happily Ever After when the unresolved issues surface once again. When Cinderella or Ariel or whoever is once again feeling anxiety and decides to run away again, this time from a marriage or some other responsibility. For young women especially, such fairy tale dreams are most often in reality nightmares because they never take responsibility for themselves and deal with their own anxiety. They're perpetually wanting to be rescued. Or what about the young men who our culture has trained to believe that their happiness is bound up in whatever feels good in the moment? That when things get tough, they can bail out and find another person to be with. The number of absent fathers in our families and in our culture is staggering. Men have learned to abdicate responsibility in service of their own desires. I often wonder what would happen in any of these fairy tale stories if the prince had seen Rapunzel in the tower or Cinderella in her home, and hearing the girl's needy cries for help, wanting to be rescued from the wicked witch who was simply trying to help the girl take responsibility for herself, and in his most princely, self-differentiated way had said to the doe-eyed damsel in distress, "Wow, that's a tough situation. I imagine it's hard for you. I wonder what you're going to do about that." Would have made a less interesting story, but a much healthier one. Or if someone had taken the prince aside and said, this relationship has to be based more on love and respect and responsibility than the girl's shoe size. Cinderella's stepmother is a great fable because it brings home the point that there is no happily ever after if the anxiety in the family system is never resolved and no one self-differentiates. You think that by running away from responsibility, little Cindy is going to be healthy as an adult who learns to manage her own anxiety? What happens when Prince Charming is no longer so charming because of his own anxiety? What happens when nobody comes to the rescue? Can you imagine these people then running a kingdom or a company? In their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which is a marvelous book, I recommend it to you, The Coddling of the American Mind, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff argue that our culture as a whole has traded in responsibility and resilience for safety and self-indulgence. And that cultural shift has led to a lot of problems with our emerging generations. They point out three untruths that seem to be driving the approach of many families, schools, and institutions today. The first one is the untruth of fragility. We're teaching kids that failures, insults, painful experiences, and accountability for their actions will do lasting damage to them. In other words, rather than saying to them, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, we're saying what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Kids are seen as fragile, and thus we protect them from anything that might harm their sensitive selves. Helicopter parenting tries to ensure that children never face anything challenging. But the truth is that human beings need stressors, challenges, and responsibility in order to grow. We need to have the capacity to fail in order to be resilient. The second untruth is that of emotional reasoning. We live in a culture that tells our young people to always trust their feelings. It doesn't matter what's true as long as you feel it is. And in such a culture, the most sensitive people become insensitively tyrannical, as we learned in A Nervous Condition. Only trusting our feelings puts us in constant lizard brain mode. We need to teach reasoning and responsibility, even if it doesn't make the kids feel good all the time. As the prophet Jeremiah reminds us, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? Follow your heart? No. Follow the truth. And the third untruth is the untruth of us versus them. This particular untruth is often on display in an election year. Would put people into categories of good and evil, and there they remain hard and fast. But this is fairy tale thinking. Sometimes the wicked person, like Cinderella's stepmother, is just trying to help another person be responsible. Sabotage is a real thing in family systems. When someone tries to set boundaries and maintain the emotional immune system, the unhealthy people in the system are going to react badly. They want to bring things back to homeostasis, to the status quo. We have to resist the idea that experiencing pain and disagreement shouldn't be part of life. It is part of life. We need to learn to see the perspective of the other. There's always another side to the story. Now, we're past the dates for Mother's and Father's Day, but I want to celebrate all of the wicked moms, stepmoms, dads, stepdads here in the audience today. Because you're willing to be self-differentiated, non-anxious, and deal with all the sabotage that comes from children learning to take responsibility for themselves. Your wickedness could just be the ticket to your child's long-term emotional health. Now, I'm not talking about being mean for mean's sake. I'm talking about teaching responsibility. I find it interesting that the one story in the Gospels that concerns Jesus' childhood involves his mom defining expectations. Now, we read the story earlier. Jim read it for us. The story about Jesus in the temple is most often used to show that Jesus had an early hint of his life and mission as the Messiah. I agree with that. But what interests me most from a systems perspective is that it really points to the effectiveness of Mary as a mother, and we assume Joseph as a dad. So the way the story works is this. They've been in Jerusalem for the festival, and now the family is on its way home. They've been traveling home for a full day. Now, if you look at the geography, Jerusalem sits on top of a mountain ridge, and to travel a day, you would have gone down past sea level to go down to the Dead Sea Valley, the Jordan River Valley, to then turn north and go to Galilee. So thinking about 10 to 12 miles a day for travel, Mary and Joseph had traveled down 4,000 feet from Jerusalem to Jericho in 13 miles. So they get to the bottom of the mountain and they discover that Jesus is not in the caravan. They thought he was maybe back playing with cousins or whatever. He is not there. And when they discover him missing, they have to go back up to Jerusalem, 4,000 feet and 13 miles to look for him. And they look for him for 3 days. Can you imagine? You lose your kid in Walmart for 5 minutes, you're freaking out. 3 days. Finally, they find him there in the temple. And she does what a good mom will do. She demands responsibility from the boy, owning her anxiety. We've been searching for you for 3 days. We've been all over the place. Your face is already on the milk carton. Where have you been? What have you been doing? We were worried sick. And Jesus responds with this famous line, didn't you know where I'd be? In my Father's house. Jesus was about God's business, which was great. But he's still their boy. It's the next line that makes the most intriguing statement to me, however. Verse 51. Right after all this, then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. I'll bet he was. I bet there was a lot of conversation on the way back north. Jesus was special for sure, but I kind of believe that Mary may have had a good talk with him about responsibility. After all, at 12, he's on the cusp of bar mitzvah, on the cusp of adulthood, to talk with him about boundaries. Now, she may have expressed her own anxiety and owned it, teaching Jesus to do the same. And when they got home, she probably set limits. She had expectations. She shared her own beliefs. She even made the Son of God do some work around the house. Because you see, I'm thinking if she hadn't done those things, the next verse would not have come to pass. Verse 52, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. Jesus grew up to become, in my opinion, the most self-differentiated, non-anxious person who ever lived. Now, granted, you could attribute that theologically to his divine nature, and that's great. But we have to remember that Jesus was also fully human. I tend to think that Jesus became who he was in large part because he was given a good example at home. And nobody has ever called Mary wicked, right? Learning to take responsibility for ourselves, learning to own our own anxiety, learning to set boundaries, learning to pay attention to our own role in all of our relationships. These are the keys to taking the dis out of dysfunctional families and organizations. It's hard work, but nothing worth doing comes easy, especially raising kids. So here's to all you parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, you wicked, self-differentiated, responsibility-giving parents. Today's your day. Celebrate it. And remember, the truth is that a healthy dose of living trumps the fairy tale every single time.